Now, when working with such dynamic routes, such dynamic paths, there are two interesting variations or extensions of that concept you should be aware of. One variation or extension is that you can, of course, also have nested dynamic paths. So let's say, besides portfolio/project ID, we also have another folder, the clients folder, let's say, and we want to construct a nested path here where we have a dynamic client ID, which can be different for the different clients. And then for every client ID, we have some static pages, like a list of all projects we did with that client, but then also dynamic nested paths for the individual projects we did with the client. Not clear what I mean? Let me show it to you. So for clients, I might want an index.js file where I list all my clients. So here we could have a function which I name clients page, and then I return a div here with a h1 tag of the clients page, and close the div, of course. And I export that. And of course, that's nothing new here at this point. But then I want to have a dynamic path, but a dynamic path with nested paths. So not a file named square bracket something.js, but instead we can have a subfolder which also has this square bracket name. So here we could then have the ID of a client. But now that's not a file, that's a folder with this special name. And then here again, we could have an index.js file. And that could, for example, list all the projects or all the client projects. So all the projects for a given selected client. And hence here I have a div where I say the projects of a given client. And we export this as well. And we could have more static files here, like an overview.js file or whatever. But we can now also have another dynamic folder or file nested inside of this already dynamic folder. For example, let's say for a selected client, we then have different projects. So here we have the client project ID identifier. And of course, as always, what you write between the square brackets is up to you. So this could then be a page for an individual project for a selected client. So the selected client project page, whatever. That could be a name here. And I'm just coming up with some examples here because, of course, these are use cases you could encounter in a real app you're building. So the project page for a specific project for a selected client. And we can also export that. Okay, so with that, I added a bunch of new folders and files. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we have this dynamic folder name. How could we now reach those different files and pages? Well, we can enter /clients to reach this index.js file. And there's nothing special about this. If I enter /clients, I see the clients page, which is the output of this functional component. But now we have this dynamic ID segment folder, and in there we have an index.js file as well, where we, for example, want to list all the projects of a given client. So therefore, we could enter clients/max, if that would be the identifier of a given client, and we see the projects of a given client, which is the output of this page here. And then we can also drill even deeper with yet another dynamic segment with clients max project 1, if that would then be the ID of a specific project for this specific client. And therefore we now see this output. And in all these pages, we can of course get access to the concrete values entered in the URL. So here in the selected client project page, we can again import use router from next router. And then in here, simply get access to the router by calling use router, and then console logging router query. And if we do that, we see that we do get an object with two properties now, because I am logging this in a component that is loaded for a file name with a dynamic segment, which is inside of a folder with a dynamic segment. And you always get access to all the concrete values for the different placeholders that might have been part of the overall path for which this component was loaded. So therefore, we get access to the concrete ID value, since we're in that dynamic ID folder. And then since we're in this dynamic client project ID file, we also get access to that concrete value, so that we can use all these values in our project or in our component file here to then fetch the specific project for this specific client, for example. Now, if I would use router in the index.js file inside of the ID folder here, and therefore, of course, we also need to import use router here as well. So if we import use router from next/router, if I do that, then you will see that if I visit just/max, and therefore this index.js file, we of course only get access to the ID property here, because that is, well, just in the ID folder and not inside of this client project ID JavaScript file now. So that's how we can load pages dynamically for various dynamic parameters and how we can get access to these parameter values. And as mentioned before, in the upcoming sections about data fetching and so on, we are of course also going to leverage those dynamic values.